Today we will be discussing homophobia in workspaces and society. Members of the LGBTQI+ community face discrimination all the time, especially in the workplace. How can these issues be addressed, and what are the solutions that can be enforced in workspaces and society? All of this and more, Workers' World starts now.
From England to Poland, every step across the ocean, the ruling classes them is in a mess. Oh yes, the capitalist system regress, but the Soviet system now progress. So which one of them you think is best?
Welcome to the weekly Workers' World Labour Show. I'm your host, Tashrik Trubadi. Thanks again for according us your time. Michaela Miller is standing by. She'll join us later for the news. Most people in South Africa have suffered from one form of discrimination or another, either because of their social status, race, gender, or religion. For a segment of the working class, they are targeted because of their sexual orientation, even though it does no harm to others or society. These people can be lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer, or intersexual, simply referred to as the LGBTQI+ community. In today's show, we explore the sexual orientation of workers and how they are discriminated against. More importantly, how can discrimination and oppression of the LGBTQI+ community be addressed, and in what form? But first, let's go now to the insert prepared for us by the Workers' World Media Productions editorial team.
So homophobia is the hate towards people who you think are not of the same sexual orientation or gender identity.
They actually took up, the issue of the dress code within the SPS. So I reported the case the case with the Equality Court, which is the CGE, the Commission of Gender Equality, where I reported the dress code being very problematic, not accommodating the queer people.
My previous work, I was a manager, and I was under a training by a area coordinator. At first I wasn't aware of such, but someone making an eye good man nati. Each and every time we in the meeting, are you aware of she's raising same statement, God created men and women, these other genders? At first I wasn't aware, but now ever since you make an eyebrow on me, each and every time when we attend a management meeting, she keep on saying one thing over and over and over. That's when I realized this is an harassment.
A sexual orientation is about an identity. It's about the gender that you are attracted to. So if you are heterosexual, you would be a male attracted to a woman, or a woman attracted to a male. Okay. If you are homosexual, you might be attracted to the same sex. So your sexual orientation is who you are attracted to, and who you would have those sexual feelings for.
I'm doing an example. If you're gay, they will give you a task engayenzwa amadoda, like opening boxes, moving shelves, like hard labor work. You understand? But they will give you that type of a work, and then they will emphasize but your contract, you said you're a male, you're not a female.
Firstly, I think is to understand what does LGBTQI mean, and secondly is to know rights as the LGBTQI and the way they feel.
They're facing a lot of stuff, discrimination, abuse, stuff like that. I'm not against it, because I like women and boys. Because some bosses, they don't like people that's lesbian or gay. So you don't like it. And that must come to an end because we're all human beings.
Phofu kweli le-gay ndingathi abanye bangaya-undermine-wa okanye mhlawumbi umuntu angathathelwa ntweni ndingacinga njalo phaa kwi-gay ngoba kaloku i-gay.
Can't definitively say as NUMSA whether homophobia is rife, but certainly forms of discrimination are rife, so we can presume those that are rife.
I was a pastor before, and then I was judged by a congregation.
Unfair treatment within the workplace, you start being a victim.
Homophobic is where they kill you, it's where they rape you. They say that I'm trying to correct you, especially I'm a woman, lesbian woman, and then I will say, I want to correct you. I want to teach you a lesson.
To deal with discrimination, you at all levels, whether you're a woman, whether you're LGBT plus, needs, both at the policy level, but it also needs practices, companies, employers that are willing to do that.
People, they've been fired because of their sexuality, and then they come to report to us. But because of we don't know which channel that we have to take in terms of reporting the unions, that they have to accommodate them as a human being in a space, because now they are fighting the right of workers.
A lot of loopholes are used to sort of oppress, the queer voice within the workplace. And the law is actually something that is being used to sort of, create those spaces where these issues cannot be addressed.
If you happen to be in an organized workplace where there's a union, then at the same time you would make sure that your union is aware, whether that's through the shop stewards or the regional leadership, you make sure that they're aware.
I don't think that unions are taking LGBTI issues seriously in the workplace.
The law is there, and the law is supposedly there to protect you. But to actually be able to use that law, the institutions of the state need to be protecting you as well. So if you go to the police station to report something, you need to have someone who understands and takes up your issue. If you go to the health, to the clinic, to the hospital. And so I think that even though we've got a very important legislation in place, the institutions of the state are not prepared yet. And then the broader society is rejecting it.
All right, so there we have it, that in spite of our very progressive constitution, some very real challenges remain. Imagine being a female in the workplace and there are challenges with attaining your rights. Now imagine being part of this particular community. That struggle becomes a bit harder, and that's a conversation we're having right now. I have Nina Benjamin, the Gender Program Manager for Labour Research Service. Also Aluta Humbane, the Human Rights Advocacy Officer for the Lesbian and Gay Community and Health Centre. And Bayanda Ndumiso, the Political Advocacy Coordinator at the Triangle Project. Thank you so very much for having joined us. Aluta, I want to start off with you, maybe by defining the different types of sexual orientations that fall under the LGBTQI plus community.
All right, good evening. Thank you very much. I think I like the fact that you're speaking to sexual orientation, but a lot of people still need to be educated on the difference between gender identity and sexual orientation. But for the purpose of the interview, I will engage critically on the alphabets of what defines sexual orientation. So we define sexual orientation as an assumption of who you are attracted to, so as opposed to gender identity, which speaks to your own personal constructed identity, socially constructed identity, which is often defined by male and female, with a deviation or an extension of transgender identifying individuals. When it comes to sexual orientation, we look at, there's about 48 plus different types of sexual orientations. But for the conversation that we are having now, we are obviously looking at 4 or 5, and this is lesbian, which is quite often referred to a woman who's attracted to another woman of the same sex. Then we have gay, who identifies as man but is attracted to another man. We have bisexual, who identifies as man or woman, who may fall in love with the opposite sex or the same sex at any given time. And then we have transgender identifying bodies who express themselves different from the heteronormative ideas that we have envisioned or that we are aware of. So it would be individuals who may have been born and given at birth an identity to say on their gender marker they are perhaps male or female, but might not necessarily ideally see themselves in that manner. And so I think,
Yeah,
and then
I want
obviously
to
we
pick
have
up. I want to pick up on something you
intersex.
mentioned a bit earlier with Nina very quickly. Is there variations in the type of discrimination that's either based on what the sexual preference would be or what the gender identity would be? Do they vary based on that, or is it pretty much the same thing?
I think that with sexual orientation, obviously, that you're not necessarily going to see that. I mean, unless someone says to you, I'm a lesbian or I'm gay. I mean, with gender identity, often it seems more obvious. And so the kinds of ways people relate to that, because I think with gender identity, it could be that you may be a trans person or a person who kind of your sexual orientation might be lesbian, but you might be also more kind of male identifying in a way. And so in that sense, I suppose it's just people's different prejudices will come into play. Underpinning all of that is fear. A fear of what you think is different, and you respond to that fear.
And I want to pick up on that quickly, Nina, with Bayanda. When we describe it as the fear, is it because the fear of the unknown or fear of the difference?
I think we've moved a long time away from the unknown. I think everybody that is in South Africa, and especially in the workplace, by now I believe that everyone understand what the spectrum of sexuality is, right? The LGBTIQ plus word. And I think people fear because they don't want to associate themselves with the sexuality or sexual orientation. And so often people take it up on themselves then to create fear, right? And to say that because I don't want to associate myself with this community, I fear that if I do, I'm going to be seen a particular way, I'm going to be taken a particular way.
And I want to pick up on that,
people.
how we're being seen, and the fact that, is fear of the unknown shouldn't be a reality, but we'll get into that and more once we return from the break.
Highlights this week. NIA condemns the violent arrest of trade unionists in Zimbabwe. Department of Employment and Labour expected it recovers over 2 million rand for non-compliance with labour legislation. COSATU in the Free State condemns the non-payment of workers in some municipalities. SAPTU settles for a 7% wage increase for woven cotton textile workers. NUMSA signs the wage proposal with Eskom, and Pakistan garment workers report shocking lack of fire exit. All this and more later in your full bulletin. To continue this week's topic of discussion, here's Tashrik.
Okay, we're in it. The conversation, particularly about the type of discrimination that people from the LGBTQI plus community face. In the earlier segment, we underscored the fact that there is a fear of the unknown, but also the unknown can no longer be an excuse any longer. And that is the conversation we want to take now to the types of discrimination that we see in the workplace. Aluta, what are the types of discrimination? Give me some of the basic ones, that this community feel as if though they're finding it difficult to be themselves in the workplace.
Well, I think perhaps it starts at a level of management where policy is not really reformed, to be inclusive of gender non-conforming identifying bodies. So it then triples itself down because now the expression of the deviation of masculinity and of femininity is always met with prejudice and discrimination. So you know there are cases that I've attended where department officials, especially in schooling environments, perhaps where they may identify as transgender, and just the right to express themselves by dressing up according to how they feel in terms of their gender expression is limited or curtailed. It also extends itself to how they are treated in the workplace in terms of very vulgar and very disruptive kind of slurs that will be passed against them, which creates a very big cognitive dissonance and adds to a very unstable mental depreciating kind of abnormalities that exist then in the workplace. So majority of the people find themselves really excluded from participating in the workplace. They are victimized, they are called names, and as a result it becomes very unbearing or unbearable.
Bayanda, let's pick up on what are the signs that we can identify in the workplace that would be, I suppose, the clearest description of different types of discrimination.
Number one, I think one can be delayed a promotion based on, especially if it's a promotion relating to representing the company or the organization based on how they look. Number two, it can be sharing a workspace, amenities like, the homophobic belief that all homosexual people want to force themselves, or anyone sexually makes people sharing spaces like restrooms uncomfortable. Participating in social activities at workplace presents a challenge for a work with the same sex partner. And I mean, at first hand in an interview, if one appears to be different compared to, to the name or to the picture that they sent pre-interview, one can be judged based on that because that is not the normal Bayanda that we know. So this happens in a different spaces in a workspace where also informal conversations can happen, right? That are speaking to sexuality, gender, but you are there, but people are talking about your life. And actually, these happen more often in a workspace where there's young people and people express their beliefs and end up saying that it's my belief, it's what I believe in, but directly harming you. So these are some of the examples where one can be violated directly or indirectly in a workspace.
Yeah. Well, Nina, the reality though is that we have this constitution. I'm wondering, what does in the workplace a policy look like, and how would that policy speak to a changing of culture and attitude, because that expression of attitude, I suppose, is also broadly applicable to society. So how do we fundamentally address some of these levels of discrimination?
I just wanted to pick up on what Bayanda said. We've also had cases where people are actually dismissed with false charges because of the level of homophobia in the workplace. And one of the more challenging aspects is that there's a sense that you've got nowhere to go. You can't go speak to the HR person, the union representative is not sensitized, so you don't feel comfortable speaking to him or her. So yeah, as I say, I wanted to add on to some of the, just what do you do when you're there? I think if we go a little bit beyond the Constitution and actually just look at the labor legislation, I mean, something like the Basic Conditions for Employment Act, which sets minimum workplace environment. So, the way, for example, leave is identified. Things like parental leave or family responsibility leave is much more open. But the question still comes then is, when you are able to then assert that, is the person that's representing you, or are you able to get through the manager's head that parental leave includes a same-sex partner? So even though it's there in the law and it's a minimum right, and you don't even have to negotiate or that it exists there, it's very difficult to actually access it because of the kind of levels of discrimination that sits there. I think that policies, workplace policies, need to constantly be taking into account what the legislation is saying and what maybe you've managed to negotiate around. And that's, I think, part of the challenge is that are we creating policies that take into account new legislation that's come through? Are we constantly monitoring that policies? So, but I mean, policies is only one aspect of it. There's all other kinds of, but it can only happen if the policy allows for that. If there's conditions put in place to actually create that, yeah. So, so I think the relationship between that and our broader rights is what we do on a day-to-day basis in that workplace. And whether all, LGBT plus workers have people who can act as representatives, can help. They're part of collectives where they are able to have voice, which obviously has another set of challenges. Being able to be part of a union and not be discriminated by your fellow workers becomes part of what the challenge is in a union environment. That the union needs to address.
Well, and I think that is, the systemic challenges that we sit with, and that is how to address it, not just in the workplace, but in society as well. That and more we'll discuss once we return from the break. All right, so we have a serious problem with discrimination, but they come in different forms and they appear to be layered. And that's what I want to talk to you about, Aluta, very quickly. How does one prove discrimination when sometimes, for instance, one of the examples that were mentioned earlier, somebody that's from the LGBTQI plus community, they would not get a promotion because, it is felt that perhaps they are for some reason or the other not best suited for that particular position. What if that position isn't informed by any sort of labor, very real managerial rationale, but there is a discrimination there? Can that discrimination actually be proven?
Unfortunately, there's no barometer of which to engage or capture homophobia. And quite often it happens so overtly that, there's not even structures in which you can report it, because you find that even in the spaces where the unions exist, it's still a very heteronormative space where heteronormativity is highly protected and guarded. And any questions of questioning or going against the status quo, which is premised on gender identities which are structured and normal, does not really yield to any assistance. I myself was a teacher, and I faced a lot of discrimination at the working space. And instead of being able to get help, I ended up resigning because I could not get any help.
Sorry, Aluta, sorry, can you give us...
unions assisting me, I ended up being more victimized.
Yeah, Aluta, I just want to stay with you very quickly. Can you give us examples of how you were discrimination? Give us broad examples of that discrimination that you yourself felt couldn't be addressed.
So, in my instance, I was given, when I complained about a lot of things and how I was treated in the workplace, I then was met with a incredibly big workload. So basically, I was teaching more classes for speaking out, and I could not really go to the unions because if I went to the unions, then the unions were very heteronormative based. So they would protect the agenda of saying, yes, but you are queer. Just stay in your school and just listen to your principal. But at the end of the day, it really hit me psychologically when I hit depression. And I realized that no ways, instead of working in this space, I need to get out. And I think that's what we end up resorting to, that we find that high numbers of LGBTI people who are unemployed or others who deviate and then go into business because the environment in which they find themselves is not conducive. On a daily basis, you have to sensitize people about who you are. because they are not sensitized. That alone just takes you away from the work that you have to do. It becomes a battle each day just to be in that working environment. And the government and the institutions that exist who are supposed to be implementing those policies which are speaking about inclusivity have not invested anything towards ensuring that there's adequate sensitization and workshops in the working place so that people are aware that, hey, it's just not only heterosexual people who exist in the world. There are deviations from a heteronormative kind of existence, and this is perhaps how you treat them.
Yeah. Bayanda, how does one address this? Because from Aluta's experience there, that even going to the union was a bit of a challenge. And so evidently it's a matter that's beyond just the actual workplace.
I mean, even where there is an awareness of law, this does not automatically lead to changes in the attitudes and behaviors, right? As Aluta is highlighting. One can only, react when discrimination has happened, but must rather find ways of dealing with a range of informal engagements and punishments in between. If you speak up, you become more silent because you'll be punished, right? Directly or indirectly. What I'm going to is the fact that there's a bigger talk here that we must form an organizational culture where we are able to learn together as people that work in the same space about different things, and how one does not only just come as an Aluta that is a teacher in that space, but comes with an identity, with a background that allows them to be who they are in that workspace. So workspaces needs to realize that one comes with an intersectional identity that allows them to function in a workspace. And if any workspace does not see that and does not actually make provisions to have learning cycles, workshops, and conversations that are creating a safe and a well-run space that protects everyone in the workspace, that just is there, but also people are still violating it indirectly with just having an opinion whenever they can, and no one is holding them accountable.
What level of accountability do you think is required here, Nina? How does one deal with this effectively? Is it punitively? Is it education? I'm just quite curious to understand what are the ways that we can deal with this type of discrimination.
I think if you take Luther's experience, it cannot rest with the individual, having to fight on all these levels. And I hear what he's saying, what is being said about the union, and that there's no. Even the organization that's supposed to be there to protect your rights, you're almost having to fight with them as well. So a big part of this is not, I think it's also what Bayan is saying about what is that institutional or that organizational culture. And that you're dealing with that every day. So that might be informal, but there are a lot of formal mechanisms that need to be taken up, and not just by the LGBT plus person. It must be done by whoever's interested in making that an inclusive space. And so that will, that extends to the kind of, to keep an eye on the issue around benefits, around workplace conditions, around facilities that are there, and chipping away at all of that. And so when you look, you are doing that, you're saying, is this friendly to women? Is this friendly to people living with disabilities? It's looking at it in a much more inclusive way, and in that way, challenging the kind of environment that's set up there. Obviously, other issues around sensitization and is part of that. But I think it's about a sensitization, which is how do you make this place, this workplace, a place that works for everyone that's in it. Not how do you make the workplace just for, looking specifically at the gay person or the, putting a spotlight on them only, and then expecting them to speak out, to be an advocate. I think that just intensifies your sense of you have to resign. The pressure's too much. You have to be your own advocate and fight for all of this on your own then,
Yeah. Aluta, just very quickly, before I go to the break.
Can I add something, please?
Very quickly, Bayanda.
I think for me also, Nina, I've seen this in different workspaces where they actually make, the queer person or the gay person that is actually raising these issues of homophobia and leading these conversations What this means then, you continue to experience violence because you're using your body and your feelings to teach other people. And workspaces needs to run away from that because it's a continuation of being violent. Making actually the person that is complaining, the one that is leading that discussion, is violent also. It's a form of violence as well. HR has a responsibility, same as them leading conversation around sexual harassment, having a conducive working place. They must take it up on themselves to lead those conversations, to form those workshops, and actually everyone to attend those workshops is equally so as putting education and open education for everyone to participate in that conversation, and not using the queer person to be the one leading those conversations, which continues to harm the queer person in that space, which leads them to be out of that space because their body and their physical body and emotional is being used as an example to learn.
Yeah. All right. And I'm going to pick up on that, the sensitivity particular element, and more so, what do we do when we don't know? And most of the facilities argument is what I want to get into after the break. And of course, Michaela Miller standing by with the news as well.
A very warm welcome to you. I hope you're keeping safe. I'm Michaela Miller. Thanks for joining us. The National Education, Health and Allied Workers Union condemns the growing violent and unjustified arrest of trade unionists by the government of Zimbabwe. The Amalgamated Rural Teachers Union of Zimbabwe President Albert Masurare was arrested in connection with the death of R2's member back in 2016. Now believes this to be opportunistic, especially since the magistrate court ruled out foul play following an inquest. The Department of Employment and Labour Inspection and Enforcement Services in the Western Cape Province recovered approximately 2 million rands during an inspection conducted in the 2021 and 2022 financial year.
In the Western Cape, we received, out of 750, there's 26 fraud cases that we received. So we finalized 10 and the 16 that is outstanding. One case that is in Atlantis, when AGO applied for 36 employees. We pay them this amount, 141,000, and Asset Forfeiture Unit has assisted us to recoup this money. There are monies that we have gotten back through Asset Forfeiture Unit. I think it's about 280 something million rands that we got back. And then SIU also is through their investigation. I think we got about 22 million that they recovered on our behalf. And as things progress, more and more people are getting arrested.
The Congress of South African Trade Unions in the Free State condemns the failure of some municipalities to pay salaries of workers across the province. The non-payment of salaries has been persistent despite the introduction of multiple interventions to help resolve this unacceptable situation. The South African Clothing and Textile Workers Union settled its 2022 and 2024 wage negotiations with a 7% increase in the woven cotton textile subsector. This new 2-year collective agreement was concluded under the National Textile Bargaining Council, with employers represented by the Southern African Cotton and Textile Process Employers Association. The collective agreement is effective from the 1st of July 2022 until the 30th of June 2024. The National Union of Metal Workers of South Africa secured a victory against Eskom. This comes after the collapsed wage negotiation and a strike. NUMSA, together with other unions, and negotiated with Eskom management as part of the Central Bargaining Forum.
It's broken down in the following way. The duration is a 1-year agreement and there's a 7% across the board salary increase. Conditions of service will be reinstated. These conditions which existed as of 30 June 2021 will be reinstated effective from 1 July 2022. And a housing allowance which will increase by 400 Rand for the period 1 July 2022 to 30 June 2023. NUMSA will always fight to improve conditions of the working class.
It has been 10 years since the Ali Enterprises fire killed over 250 garment workers in Pakistan. There is still no safety agreement that holds employers and international brands accountable or for implementing basic safety protocols. According to an incidents tracker, over a dozen incidents resulted in deaths and injuries in garment factories in Pakistan over the past 18 months. In addition, in factories where women account for the majority of workers, only 3/4 of workers reported that they had access to escape routes that were clear from obstruction. Well, that's it up from my side. If you have any story you'd like to share with us, you can send us an email to labour@wwmp.org.za. Over to Tashrik to conclude this week's topic of discussion on homophobia in the workplace.
All right, thanks there to Michaela Miller with this week's news. Let's pick up on our conversation. What about the fact, Nina, I'll start off with you on this. You earlier mentioned facilities, and we've seen in certain places, let's call them workplaces for now, but technically they're schools where people are at work. But there's an almost progressive approach to say, let's have toilets and facilities available, you know, that doesn't quite go to the traditional form of identification. Do you think, you know, those would be progressive steps forward? And should something like that be replicated in every workspace? I'm just wondering, what would be a demonstration to say, let us become as progressive as possible to make this place as inclusive as possible?
So I think things like facilities send out a message. It's saying that you're taking different needs into account. So yeah, I think it plays an important role. But I think it's also, you know, the kind of workplace that you're wanting to create also needs the conversations in the workplace. And you need to be able to, I mean, because different workplaces are constructed differently. Yeah, so I think let me leave it there. I think that facility sends out an important message, yeah.
Yeah. Aluta, you earlier referred to the unions where you yourself had a very difficult period there. And we know that in 2012, COSATU, as part of its 11th National Congress, had passed a resolution, very long one, which I don't have time to read, but it, in essence, is calling for an orientation of both union bosses, management, etc., to become a bit more familiar with not only just the types of variations, but more so the types of rights that ought to be protected for those workers. Why do you feel that isn't finding place in the representation that you would have had they been sensitive to your own challenges? Aluta?
I think Aluta's fallen off.
All right, let's come back to Aluta at another time. Bayanda, let me put that to you. You know, the fact that one would have thought that a union is there to protect the worker, but even that appears to be a challenge. Why do you think that is the case?
I think for me, there are a lot of assumptions that, number one, civil society organizations like trade unions, like organizations that work on human rights, that those people are actually very much educated about these issues. That assumption continues to perpetuate a kind of violence and a kind of opportunity to educate people that are on those spaces. And I think that we must do away with that assumption that trade unions still need to be sensitized as well. People that work in the civil society organizations still need to be sensitized as a way, because they form part of the bigger community that also participates in different forms of violence, right? And in different forms of experiencing different kinds of living, right? So what I'm saying is the fact that we must not assume that because one works in a trade union or in a civil society space, they are aware of these issues. And rather have the intention to continuously sensitize and intentionally educate everybody that is in a workspace. So that's my first initial thinking around, like, assuming the fact that because one is in a trade union is always going to believe in realization of every identity, every
Yeah.
human right or an identity of a human. That is not always the case. The case is people do come with their beliefs. They do come with their social norms in a workspace because it's a community on its own. And
Yeah.
one needs to still be educated in that space.
Okay, and I want to pick up on that. People that come with their beliefs and their own social norms. Aluta, is there space for an argument that says I have an ideological difference, I have a religious difference, I have a anthropological difference? Is there space for an argument like that, or is that also viewed as particularly having an indifference to somebody that wishes to embrace however they feel they wish to?
I think again we really have to really begin to embrace diversity in its whole entirety, and to limit one's expression is violation of one's constitutional right. But we must also be aware that the workplace is a professional space where we come to create economic, ideological constructs and have certain outputs. Perhaps we need to adopt a stance that says, when we get into this work environment, let's leave our personal beliefs, cultural beliefs, religious, whether they're cultural beliefs or societal beliefs, let's leave them outside the gate and assume a professional stance. I know when it comes to ethics and professional development, we are not all equipped.
Yeah.
But perhaps
I want to talk, Aluta, about how do we become equipped once we return from the break. How do we become equipped to deal with this and leave our prejudices at home? All right, now what if I do believe that I have a personal difference? Is that thrusted upon me, or how can I leave it at home, do my work, but in the process not discriminate against somebody else? That's this part of our conversation. And let's pick up with that with you, Aluta. Is there a way to leave it at home? What if somebody feels quite strongly that they do not, necessarily galvanize or agree with perhaps your orientation or your perspective on sexuality and gender and so on? What do you have to say to those people?
Well, what I can say is that ideally, I believe we are all pushing for a space where we can look past our sexual and gender differences. Perhaps they exist as to mediate and amplify our differences and diverse so that we can begin to be tolerant and respectful of one another. But I think adopting an educational stance becomes the first step to say, hey, are you aware that there's no need to have a certain phobia towards a certain group of people, because the stigmas and the preconceived notions that you have might not necessarily be what you have been told to be. So through education and social cohesion, perhaps we can then begin to understand one another, because we still find ourselves, even in the workspaces, not integrated. You find that there's a very few allies who are able to accommodate everybody. But if we had to dismantle those kind of pockets and begin to social coerce, perhaps then it can begin to be the starting point of saying, you get to know who I am as a human being, right past my sexuality, past my gender identity first, so that you can then begin to accept me, respect me as a human being rather than a transgender woman or a lesbian woman or a gay man and so forth.
All right, Bianda, policy is there, and we have the protection, we have the constitution, we have the stuff on paper, right? How do we translate this into actual attitudes, in the demonstration of respect? For instance, the argument that says you may not need to accept, but at least you need to respect.
Yeah, as I said before, I think one of my experiences was to have, maybe in the past, to have colleagues that respect me in a work environment, right? And they make sure that they respect my opinion and respect my position. But when it comes to community or us bumping to each other, they would not greet or look my way. And for me, I didn't have a problem with this because it's a personal choice and not wanting to be seen associated with gayness or a gay person. I don't have a problem with that. But in a workspace, one has to be really, really professional and tolerant enough so that they don't make the workspace for me unsafe and violent. So I do believe that in that concept when it comes to being professional, coexisting in a working space, and anything else outside that workspace, one is not obliged really to be friends with me or associate with me.
Yeah. Nina, I suppose I want to hear from you as well on that very same question. You know, the fact that people need to, I suppose, not only transform their own thinking on this, but potentially even look at how they move beyond some of the prejudices that they may have held.
Yeah, I think that, you know, Bayanda spoke about what needs to be in place, all the policies and the kind of the stick. So if you discriminate, there's actually consequences for that, and it gets picked up. So that is key, but you can't rule with a stick only. And a workplace that is, a workplace that is harsh to women, harsh, to how it treats workers, is very likely to create an environment which is very intolerant, where there's more discrimination. So you do need to look at all aspects of that workplace and begin to have an eye on how you bring everyone into that. So that can be just how the workplace is run, what the working conditions are like, what the benefits are like. I don't think there's one answer to that. But the workplace is a space where you can shift attitudes. So and it needs to be seen like that. Because even though I can have a stick, I can make sure that I've got a policy in place, there's many hidden forms of discrimination. And I can still make someone's life hell, and they won't be able to prove it, because I'm doing it in all kinds of subversive ways. So I do need to there needs to be a way that you begin to shift people's attitudes, but that's a responsibility for management, it's a responsibility for organizations that are there, and it's about the day-to-day elements of how that workplace is organized, and that's you need to be shifting that continuously. Excuse me.
All right. Aluta, does it require sensitivity training? Is something like that possible? And how much of that would be effective? I suppose it depends on the type of workplace as well.
Aluta is offline, but if you don't mind, I can take that question.
Sure, go for it, Bayanda.
I think for me, sensitization and education is actually the first point. Now, how do you translate that education? How do you make sure that that happens? I think for me, we often leave violence only to the person that is experiencing violence. Many people in a workspace, there would actually be witnesses of one being homophobic to another person, but decide to be silent and actually not get involved into making sure that the culture of homophobia and violence does not take place in a work form. So for me, I think what's important, we need to find ways where colleagues are able to protect each other, are able to point out violence, are able to point out discrimination in numbers, right? One must not be violated alone or in isolation while there's a community that has went through the same sensitization program, the same education program around these issues, and one is on their own when it comes to complaining, raising these issues. So for me, I think what's important is that, people that are sharing that working space, they must start a form of raising these issues together, identifying them together, and protect each other. Because you never know, tomorrow it might be you in a different form, in a different space, and that's why you must start practicing immediately to protect the next person, especially if you're an eyewitness, especially if you're a part of the conversation. The biggest problem is that people become silent, people make these issues only just for gay people, while they witness and actually become part of the conversation. For me, that is enabling a continuous behavior of homophobia. If you become silent, if you don't talk about it, if you don't become a witness when a person is being violated in front of you.
Yeah. Nina, do you think that, of course, the focus of the show is, the workplace? It is indeed the interest of the workers, but do you think what happens to the workers in their own community, in their own households, is very much important to influence what would happen in the workplace. And do you think that there's an argument here that perhaps some of these attitudes need also some addressing at the dinner table?
Well, I think that a key part is what happens in the home. Because I think that anyone who feels that they have the support of their family, that they feel protected at home, is going to be able to navigate life differently. And I mean, I've been in spaces where workers come together and they speak about their gay son or their lesbian daughter and all the challenges that they're facing. And that becomes then the space to open up the questions, to deal with that, so that when they go back to the home, they would have had the benefit of a different kind of conversation. So I think that, you know, a person who, so the school, the home, that kind of formative years are key. And I think that there's many spaces where those things intersect. So the workplace, people come from homes, they come from churches, they come from communities. If there's a way of having those conversations in the workplaces, I think it has spin-off effects in the community and the other way around as well.
Yeah. Bayanda, I am about to run out of time. Just from your conclusion remarks, do you think that let's address society to affect the workplace, or is it the other way around?
I think both. I think people that go in a workspace and function in a workspace are still part of the community. The same way that students or learners that are in school are still part of the community. What we need to also realize is the fact that if you educate in one of these spaces, any other space is informed by the other. So I think let's not separate these things. Let's not divorce them from each other. Let's have a holistic approach on, like, when you educate in a workspace, you still educate communities, you still educate parents that go home and transfer the information to kids, which are learners that can transfer in other spaces. So information works in that way. It gets transferred in different spaces, and we must not function in silos.
Thank you very much. That Bayanda then Dumiso. And on that note, I think, you know, he is correct that, you know, let's look at it from all different perspectives and establish a solid foundation where there is common respect and dignity that is upheld. And that is indeed the conclusion of our conversation here tonight. Thank you so very much for tuning in. We'll be back once again next week. Thank you for tuning in and have a good night.